The first cruelty of the season was meant to be quiet, a remark folded into the hush behind a fan, but Iona Bruce heard every word. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give them the satisfaction of a face rearranged to accommodate their pleasure. Edinburgh in the spring of 1811 glittered as though cruelty could not exist inside it. The assembly rooms in George Street laying down their long polished light like a challenge to the truth. And the truth was that a woman of 29 in a gown 3 seasons out of fashion had walked into a room already decided about her. The chandeliers leaned. The pillars watched. Somewhere in the corner, an unseen violin drew a note that sounded, for a breath, like a question asked of the wrong person. Spinster, someone had said. The words settled on her shoulders like a shawl she had not chosen. Spinster. It was not loud enough to be an insult. It was not quiet enough to be safe. It was the size of a coin dropped into a fountain, a small denomination of harm meant only to make a ripple. And yet the ripple traveled the length of the room and touched every person who had already agreed she was not worth much. She stood at the margin, where the polish of the floor thinned toward the wall, and let the word be. Her mother's brooch was pinned at her throat, the garnet dull, the silver clasp worn to a paler gray along the edge where a thumb had rested for 30 years, and it seemed, in that room of diamonds pretending to be stars, the only object that knew her name. Iona, the brooch pressed against the hollow beneath her jaw as if to remind her of a voice she had loved. Stand straight, her mother had used to say, a maxim carried out of a kitchen in Argyll and into every ballroom Iona would ever hate. Small candles do more honest work than large lamps. It was not admiration for what she was. It was a stubborn instruction not to apologize for it. She had turned that sentence over so many times that the edges of it had gone smooth, and even now, with her cousin Margaret laughing 3 steps away, with her hand light on the sleeve of a man who owned a house Iona had once helped her furnish, Iona could feel the small candle of herself burning steadily and unremarked. It was not admiration she wanted, precisely. It was only to be seen for a moment without the courtesy of pity. The room did not oblige. A footman passed with a tray, and the light broke on the crystal, and the light passed her by. No thunder. No curtain fell. The music began again. By the following minute, the small hostilities had rearranged themselves into a semblance of civility, and Margaret was drifting back to her with the practiced gait of a woman who had learned young that grace was a form of possession. "Iona, dearest," Margaret said, her voice the low warm shade of honey poured for a guest who was not to be told there was no bread, "you have hidden yourself again, and Aunt Fenella will not forgive me if I return without you." It was not an invitation. It was not a question. It was a summons in the register of endearment, and Iona let it lead her, because refusal in that room would only have supplied another line for the fan to hide. Margaret's gown was the color of a peach that had been permitted to ripen in a hothouse, the sort of color Edinburgh mothers called becoming when they meant expensive, and around her wrists she wore the small crystal bracelets that had come to her at 17 and never been taken off. She was 26 and had not yet been asked what she thought of anything in her life, and it had suited her. The world had asked her, instead, to be looked at, and she had made a profession of it. She was Iona's cousin on the Bruce side, closer to a sister than either woman would ever admit, and if there was any true affection between them, it lived in the way Margaret would sometimes reach for Iona's hand as they crossed a threshold, as if she needed the steadying and would rather not name what she needed it for. Beyond that, there was arithmetic. Margaret had beauty and a dowry. Iona had neither, and Aunt Fenella, who ran the household in Charlotte Square, as though every hour were an account to be balanced against the memory of a husband dead these 10 years, had long since decided which of the two nieces would be the ornament, and which the useful hand. Iona's hand had drawn the fashion plates Margaret ordered from London and altered them at the neckline where Margaret could not decide. Iona's hand had written the letters Aunt Fenella dictated when Aunt Fenella wished to be thought too grief-worn to write herself. Iona's hand had translated the Italian in the librettos Margaret carried to musical evenings and could not decipher. It was a hand that was welcome for its work and dismissed for its person, and it had been years since anyone in Charlotte Square had thanked it. It had been longer since anyone had thought to praise it. There was a design for a garden folly, drawn to precise scale on a sheet of good linen paper, that hung now in the morning room of a house in Melville Crescent, and the plate at its foot bore the name of a man who had never lifted a pencil in his life. Iona had drawn every line of that folly across 3 winter evenings while Margaret slept, and she had watched it framed and hung under another man's signature with a face so composed that Aunt Fenella had afterward remarked how sensible dear Iona was about small vanities. Small vanities. It was one of the words. There were others. Useful, when they wished her to write a letter. Sensible, when they wished her not to feel a thing. Fortunate, when they wished her to be grateful. Fortunate was the one that had begun to grow teeth. The following evening a supper had been arranged at Charlotte Square in honor of a visitor from the West, and Aunt Fenella had spent the afternoon standing in the drawing room saying the word Sutherland as if the word were a lozenge to be tasted before it was swallowed. He was a duke, or rather he was to be presented as one for the sake of the company, though the title he carried across the border was older and stranger than the English mind was willing to make polite room for, and Aunt Fenella had let it be known at 3 teas and 1 milliner's that His Grace, the Duke of Ardrossan, was to sit at her table on Thursday. Ardrossan, said the neighbors, and did not quite ask what he wanted with Charlotte Square. His seat lay north and west of anything Edinburgh troubled itself to know, in a country where the roads gave up trying to be roads and the sea came in through the windows on nights the wind chose, and he had come south in April on a matter of business that no one had been told the shape of. He was 36, unmarried, feared for the mildness of his voice, and he had, that spring, become the object of every mother's careful arithmetic, because a duke without a duchess is a sum the world insists on completing. Margaret had heard the name and gone very still at the writing desk, and then had turned to Iona and said, with the small crooked smile she used when she wished a favor disguised as a confidence, "You will help me with the seating, will you not?" It was not a question. It was a delegation. Iona had bent her head over the plan for an hour that evening, moving the small squares of card that stood for guests across the polished mahogany, with the patience of a woman rearranging her own furniture in a house she did not own, and had placed His Grace at Aunt Fenella's right, and Margaret at his other side, and herself at the far end where a lamp made a shadow of anyone sitting under it. It was the correct arrangement. It was also the arrangement Margaret would have chosen, and Iona had chosen it before Margaret could ask, so that Margaret would not have to ask, so that the small transaction between them would remain unspoken, and the affection between them would not be tested by naming it. She had learned early that some kindnesses are done best in silence, because to name them is to invite the recipient to feel the weight, and Margaret did not carry weight well. By evening the house had put on the face it kept for company. The fire was set higher than the family used it. The silver had been polished by Mrs. Gowan since dawn. And the smell in the hall was of beeswax and lemon peel and hothouse hyacinth and something else beneath, a thin, persistent scent of anxiety that only the household nose could detect. Iona stood at the top of the stair in a gown of a color so quiet it had no name, a gray that turned to the memory of blue if the candle passed close enough, and she pinned her mother's brooch at her throat with a hand that did not shake. She had refused the pearls Aunt Fenella had offered from a drawer with a tight smile, refused them courteously enough that no one could later say she had been sulky, and she had thought, as she declined, that there was more of her mother in the tarnished garnet than there was in any string of freshwater beads that had been bought to make an occasion of a girl who was not to have one. Margaret came down the passage in a gown the color of a green apple, laughing at nothing, and paused at Iona's shoulder to say, with an absent tenderness, "Oh, Iona, the little brooch again, it is so like you," and passed on. The little brooch again. Iona did not touch it. She let the words go by her ear like a moth. Her mother had worn that brooch on the last day of her life and had unpinned it from her own throat in the last hour, and had pressed it into Iona's palm and closed Iona's fingers over it with the last strength she had, and had said, "Small candles, my Iona," and had not finished the sentence because there had been no more breath in her to finish it. The sentence had finished itself in Iona's head every morning since. Small candles do more honest work than large lamps. She had been 19. She was 9 and 20 now. The sentence had not aged. They were assembled in the drawing room by the hour, and the fire had settled to its evening voice, and Aunt Fenella was standing before the mantel arranging her rings on her fingers as though the rings were troops. The bell rang below, and Mrs. Gowon's steady tread crossed the hall, and there was a pause in the drawing room, such as a room makes when a room has decided to hold its breath. Iona was at the window, straightening a curtain that did not need straightening, and she felt the room lean, and she thought, with the small ironic clarity that had become her chief companion, "So this is what a duke feels like from the wrong side of a window." Then the door opened, and Mrs. Gowon spoke the name, and the room did not so much rise as a line itself, a very small and involuntary rearrangement of shoulders and chins that only a woman used to being ignored could have measured. Ardrossan came in. He was tall, which had been reported, and dark, which had been reported, and quiet, which had not been reported truly, because the reports had used the word quiet to mean shy, and this was another kind of quiet altogether, the kind a room learns to be around. He wore black without ornament, and his coat was cut with the plainness that only excellent tailoring can afford, and he moved as if the room he was in had been prepared for him, and he wished to disturb as little of the preparation as possible. His eyes were the color of wet slate, and they went once around the drawing room in a single unhurried sweep. And Iona, at the window, felt the sweep touch her and pass without pausing, and she felt an old amusement at being invisible again in a way she had refined to a skill. He bowed to Aunt Fenella. He allowed his hand to be given to Margaret. He said good evening in a voice that did not need to be raised for it to have traveled every inch of the room already, and Iona thought, from the wrong side of the window, that whoever had named him feared for the mildness of his voice, had been telling only the smallest part of the truth. He was not mild. He was withheld. There is a difference, and the difference is a life. At supper, Iona was seated where she had put herself, at the far end under the lamp, and she was pleased with the arrangement because it left her free to watch the table, and to eat very little, and to answer only when addressed, which happened twice. Margaret bloomed at his Grace's elbow like a hothouse thing in its proper climate, and Aunt Fenella asked after his mother's health, and Ardrossan replied to each question with a courtesy, so exact it was almost a rebuke to the courtesies that had produced it. Iona observed him without seeming to observe him, which was another skill she had refined. He ate slowly. He drank almost nothing. When Margaret laughed too loud at a joke that was not quite a joke, he did not look at her. He looked, for the smallest fraction of a second, at the salt cellar, and Iona felt in that flicker of the eye an entire opinion delivered without a word. It was not contempt. He was too well made for contempt. It was the calm interest one might give a small creature crossing a polished surface. Careful not to disturb it because disturbance was inelegant, not because the creature was dear. Iona would remember, later, that this was the first thing she had understood about him, and that she had understood it before he had understood anything about her. She understood also, as the fish was removed and the fowl set down, that Aunt Fenella intended to place Margaret at his side for the rest of the season, and that Margaret intended to be placed there, and she felt no envy for the placement. She felt only, distantly, the fatigue of a woman who has spent 10 years arranging chairs at a table where she was never asked to sit. It was during the second course that a name was said which Iona had not expected to hear, and it was said in the voice Aunt Fenella kept for the ornament shelf of the conversation. His Grace's estate, Aunt Fenella said, turning her head so that the room could see the turning, was near Ardrossan, of course, though I understand a great part of his mother's people lay farther north, in Sutherland. Is that not so, sir? Ardrossan set down his glass. Not Sutherland, madam, he said. Farther west, the Isles. Ah, said Aunt Fenella, undeterred. And then, with the small dart of a woman who had rehearsed the throw, we had a connection there once, ourselves. Through my late husband's sister, she married into a small property near Lochbroom. A pity it was so remote. Iona kept her eyes on her plate. The property near Lochbroom had not been small, and the connection had not been Aunt Fenella's husband's sister, and the woman who had married into it had been Iona's own mother. It was not a lie Aunt Fenella had told for gain. It was a lie Aunt Fenella had told out of the habit of arranging inconvenient facts so that the room could hear them tidily. Iona had learned long ago not to correct the arrangements. She had learned that in the accounting of Charlotte Square, her mother's house was too far, too northern, too Highland, too quiet, too poor in the accounts that Aunt Fenella kept, and that it was easier to let it be spoken of as a small property, belonging to nobody in particular, than to remind Aunt Fenella that the small property had been Iona's home for the first 17 years of her life, and had been let to strangers ever since her father died. She kept her eyes on her plate. She noticed, without meaning to, that Ardrossan had turned his head half an inch in her direction. He had not looked at her. He had heard the word Lochbroom, and something in the word had asked the small, courteous question of his neck, and he had not permitted the question. He looked back at Aunt Fenella. Ah, he said, in a voice that gave nothing. After supper the ladies withdrew, and the men were left with the port, and Iona took herself to the pianoforte, not because she wished to play, but because the pianoforte was in the far corner of the drawing room, and the corner had a chair that faced the fire, and she wished to be in the neighborhood of a fire without being obliged to converse with anyone. Margaret sat down beside her and asked her to turn the pages of a piece she had been practicing for 3 weeks, and Iona did, and Margaret played, and the room warmed with the small false warmth a house takes on when the master is a stranger passing through. Aunt Fenella spoke of the weather in a manner that made the weather sound like a personal favor done to Edinburgh by Providence. The Miss Cargills, who had been asked to supper because Aunt Fenella believed in an audience for her triumphs, murmured in the way of women who had been told to admire and were not sure yet which piece of furniture they had been brought to admire. When the door opened and the gentleman returned, the room reordered itself again in the small involuntary way it had done at the beginning of the evening, and Ardrossan came in last, walking with the same unhurried care with which he had walked in the first time, as though every crossing of a threshold required the same courtesy of him. He looked once around the drawing room. His eyes found Margaret at the pianoforte and passed. His eyes found Aunt Fenella at the fire and paused for the length of a bow. His eyes found Iona in the shadow of the lamp and did not pass. It was not a look. It was a registering. Iona felt it settle on her the way a hand might have settled on a shoulder in a crowd. Brief, deliberate, and gone before it could be answered, and she did not turn her head, because to turn her head would have been to admit the touch, and she had not been touched in the 10 years she had been at Charlotte Square by anyone who intended it. She kept her hand on the corner of Margaret's music. She turned the page at the right bar. Ardrossan crossed the room and stopped at the piano. He did not, at first, address her. He addressed Margaret, in a phrase so exactly correct that no one could have improved it, and Margaret bloomed under it and lifted her chin so that the crystal at her wrist could catch the fire. Then, without turning his head, without change of voice, without any adjustment of face that a stranger at the far end of the room could have seen, he said, at the small volume that only Iona at his elbow could hear, "The Italian is a translator's, not the composer's." Iona did not move. She had known. She had known for a week, having found the volume in Margaret's basket and turned it to the title page and read the small line under the composer's name that no one in the room had ever thought to read. She had not said so. She had not said so, because saying so would have humiliated Margaret in a house where Iona would still have to sleep, and because Margaret was fond of the piece and it did no harm to be fond of a translation. But she had known, and Ardrossan, in the 70 seconds since he had entered the room, had known also, and had chosen to say it to the one person in the room who would neither be surprised by his knowledge nor use it against Margaret. It was not a compliment. It was worse than a compliment. It was an act of trust, delivered without warning, and Iona felt the small floor of her composure give under her foot for the length of half a breath, and then find itself again, and she said, at the same volume, "So I had thought." He did not smile. He did not look at her. He said, "Ah," in the same voice with which he had answered Aunt Fenella at supper, and moved on to speak to Mr. Cargill about a road. It was over in less than a minute. No one had heard. No one had seen. There were 3 witnesses in the room to what had happened, and 2 of them were the fire and the lamp, and the 3rd was Iona, and she was not in the habit of testifying against herself. She turned the next page for Margaret. She kept her hand steady. It was not admiration, not yet, but recognition, and the difference between them was a thing she would have to learn to hold at the length of her arm. Ardrossan did not stay late. He took his leave with the same economy of movement with which he had arrived, and Aunt Fenella walked him to the door as though she were walking him to an altar, and Margaret went with her because Margaret had been told, without being told, that she was to be seen in the hall at the moment of parting. Iona stayed at the piano, and the fire made its small settling sounds, and the Miss Cargills were putting on their shawls with the delicate deliberation of women who did not wish to leave until they had extracted the last inch of the evening's report, and Iona, unobserved for the first time in 3 hours, allowed herself one long inhalation and one long exhalation, and heard, as she did so, her own mother's voice at her ear, "Small candles, my Iona." It was not a comfort. It was an instruction. "Do the work no one is watching," said the instruction, "because the work no one is watching is the work that is truly yours." She rose from the piano bench. She adjusted the brooch at her throat with a hand that had gone cold and was already warming, and she thought, without wishing to think it, that a man with slate eyes had heard her mother's word in the middle of a supper and had turned his head half an inch. It was nothing. It was nothing at all. It was the kind of nothing she would have to be careful not to make into something, because Charlotte Square did not permit its useful hands to make somethings out of nothings, and she had lived too long as a useful hand to forget the rules of the house. By the following morning, the frost had come down onto Charlotte Square, as if to prove Aunt Fenella wrong about Providence, and the servants were laying fires in rooms that had not needed them a week earlier, and Iona was at the writing table in the small parlor at the back of the house, translating a letter from Milan that Aunt Fenella had received from a cousin of her late husband's and could not read. The letter was in the copperplate Italian of a woman who wished to be thought accomplished, and it was full of the small ornate courtesies that took twice as long to render into English as they had taken to compose, and Iona worked at them with the patient hand of a woman who had learned that patience is a form of privacy. Margaret came in an hour after breakfast in the ivory morning gown she wore when she wished to be admired at breakfast tables not her own, and stood at Iona's shoulder without offering to sit. "Iona," she said in the small, dry voice she used when she wished to be arch, "what did His Grace say to you last night at the piano?" "Nothing of note," said Iona, and did not lift her pen. Margaret waited. Iona wrote a line. Margaret said, "He stayed at your elbow for an entire minute." "He did not," said Iona. "Half a minute at most." "Half a minute is not nothing," said Margaret, and there was a small edge under the archness that Iona had heard before and had learned to answer softly. "He remarked upon the composer," said Iona, and returned to Mr. Cargill. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she laughed, and the laugh was the laugh of a woman restored to herself by the smallness of the remark. "Oh, Iona," she said, "only you would call that half a minute," and she leaned down and kissed the top of Iona's head with the affection of a proprietor who has been reassured that her property is not restless, and Iona bent her head under the kiss and did not move her pen. She finished the sentence she had been writing. She did not write the sentence she wished to write, which was that he had said the Italian was a translator's and not a composer's, and that she had said so I had thought, and that this exchange had lasted less time than a footman took to lay a plate, but had rearranged a small thing at the base of her ribs, which she did not yet trust herself to name. She wrote the next Italian courtesy instead. Margaret drifted to the window and drew the curtain wider so that the frost could be admired. Iona wrote. She did not look up. She heard Margaret say, "At the window, we shall see him at the Melville Crescent Musicale on Friday. Aunt Fenella has secured a subscription." Iona wrote. She thought, Melville Crescent, where the folly hangs. She thought, the plate at its foot bears a name that is not mine. She thought, I shall stand under my own drawing and be introduced to a duke, and no one in the room will know that the drawing is mine, and that too will be familiar. And she wrote the next sentence in her clean small hand, and she did not permit her mouth to move. The Melville Crescent Musicale was a house Iona had entered before, but only at the tradesman's hour, when a set of drawings had been carried up the area steps under her arm at 8 o'clock of a winter morning, while Margaret was still asleep upstairs in Charlotte Square. The gentleman of the house was Mr. Kilbride, a widower of 40, with a comfortable income, and a self-satisfaction so densely woven that no wife would ever have found a loose thread in it to pull. He had come to Aunt Fenella 18 months before with a request. His late wife had wished for a garden folly, he had explained, a small pavilion at the end of the walk that could be seen from the drawing-room window, and he wished to have it built as a memorial, and he wished for a design that would be talked of. He had heard, he said, that Miss Bruce had a good hand. He had said it in the voice of a man who had heard, also that Miss Bruce would work for the cost of the paper. Aunt Fenella had smiled and had said that dear Iona was so obliging, and Iona had drawn the folly across 3 winter evenings, and Mr. Kilbride had come to collect the drawing, and had asked at the door whether Miss Bruce would object to his showing the drawing about to be admired, and Iona had said no, of course not, and Mr. Kilbride had smiled and had said that he was delighted, and had then, that same week, taken the drawing to a framer and had had it fitted with a small brass plate, at the foot on which was engraved the name of Mr. Alexander Kilbride, Esquire, architect. He had not asked Iona whether he might have his name so engraved. He had not, in truth, asked Iona anything at all. Aunt Fenella, when the framed drawing was hung in the morning room of Melville Crescent, and Mr. Kilbride had begun to receive compliments on his taste and his accomplishment, had said to Iona that gentlemen were sensitive about such things, and it would not do to make a fuss over a small matter, and Iona had not made a fuss. Because at 23 a woman in her position had few defenses and fewer allies, and because to have made a fuss would have been to be called ungrateful, and ungratefulness in Charlotte Square was a currency that bought nothing but exile. She had said nothing. She had drawn nothing else for Mr. Kilbride. The Folly had been built, and the Folly stood at the end of the walk in Melville Crescent under a light snow that Friday evening, and it was a small octagonal pavilion with a shallow domed roof and a lantern above the dome, and it was the prettiest small building in Edinburgh, and Iona had drawn every line of it, and no one who admired it would ever know. The musicale was crowded, because Mr. Kilbride had a fine ear and a finer connection with a violinist who had come up from London for the winter, and Aunt Fenella arrived at the door in the state of a woman who had been assured by 3 separate sources that His Grace of Ardrossan would be present. Margaret was in the palest blue, and Iona in the same nameless gray she had worn in Charlotte Square, followed behind with the small tin sketchbook she carried when she wished her hands to have something honest to do at the edge of a room. Mr. Kilbride received them himself in the hall, and made his small compliments, and led Margaret and Aunt Fenella through into the drawing-room, and left Iona to follow, and Iona followed, and paused in the doorway to the morning-room where the Folly drawing hung, because she could not, even after 18 months, cross that threshold without paying respects to a piece of her own hand that had been renamed. She stood before it for the length of a breath. The frame was gilt. The plate at its foot said, still, Mr. Alexander Kilbride, Esquire, architect. The drawing was hers. The room did not know it. She was about to turn away when she felt, without hearing anything, that she was not alone, and she turned her head, and Ardrossan was at the door of the morning room with a glass of something untouched in his hand, and he was looking not at her but at the drawing, and his face had gone very still. He did not speak at once. He came into the room without haste, and he stopped in front of the drawing, and he stood a little farther from it than a man ordinarily would, as if he preferred to see the whole before he examined the parts, and Iona, at his shoulder without meaning to be at his shoulder, felt again the small floor of her composure adjust under her foot. He looked at the plate. He looked at the drawing. He looked at the plate again. Then, without turning his head, he said, in the voice at which he had spoken to her at the piano, "This is not Mr. Kilbride's hand." Iona did not answer. Ardrossan waited. He did not press. He waited as a man waits at a door that has been closed, expecting the door to open in its own time. Iona said, at last, at the same small volume he had used, "I am not the person to ask." "Ah," he said, and did not press further, and there was in the syllable a quality Iona had not heard in it before, an acknowledgment that a door had been closed and would not be forced. He turned then, at last, and looked at her, and she looked back at him, because she had decided in the second before he turned that she would not lower her eyes. If he had asked to see her, he would see her. His eyes were the color of wet slate. He inclined his head, the smallest fraction that could be called an inclination. "Miss Bruce," he said. "Your Grace," she said. That was all. Aunt Fenella's voice was audible from the drawing-room across the hall, arranging the world into a shape that pleased her, and the violinist was tuning behind a closed door, and somewhere a servant dropped a small piece of silver on a tray. Ardrossan did not offer his arm. He did not offer any of the small currencies of a man who has decided he wishes to be seen with a woman. He simply stood where he was and let her pass. And she passed him and went into the drawing room, and heard, as she crossed the threshold, that he had not followed her at once. He had stayed another moment before the drawing. She heard, as she took her seat at the far side of the room under a lamp that made a convenient shadow, that he had come at last into the drawing room, and she did not turn her head, and she felt, without looking, that he had chosen his own seat without reference to Aunt Fenella's arrangements, and that he had chosen it where he could see the door of the morning room, and not where he could see Margaret. The violinist played. Iona did not hear him. She heard, instead, the small voice at her elbow that had said, "This is not Mr. Kilbride's hand," and she heard, under that voice, her mother's voice saying "small candles." And she thought, with the ironic clarity that had been her chief companion for 10 years, that a candle had been noticed at last, and that noticing was not the same as being lit, and that she would have to be careful not to confuse the two. She held the small tin sketchbook on her lap. She did not open it. She did not need to draw. She kept her hands still, one over the other, and she felt, at the far side of the drawing room, the weight of a look that did not fall on her and did not need to. Margaret bloomed in the front row. Aunt Fenella arranged her rings. Mr. Kilbride stood by the mantel with the satisfied face of a man in his own house, and the folly drawing hung in the morning room across the hall under a plate that bore his name. And Iona sat under a lamp with her mother's brooch at her throat and did not permit her mouth to move. The violinist finished the first piece. There was applause, and there was the small movement of a room settling itself, and Ardrossan did not applaud. He set his glass on the small table beside him, and he looked, once, across the room, and this time his look found Iona and did not pass, and she felt it settle on her the way a hand might have settled on a wrist in a crowd, brief, deliberate, and gone before it could be answered. She kept her eyes forward. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give the room the satisfaction of a face rearranged to accommodate any pleasure at all, hers or theirs, and the violinist lifted his bow, and the second piece began, and the frost on the windows of Melville Crescent, in the light of the lamps within, made a small, persistent pattern like handwriting no one in the room had learned to read. By the following week, the frost had lifted and returned twice, in the indecisive way an Edinburgh spring made of promises it did not intend to keep. And Aunt Fenella had received 3 cards, a note, and a verbal intimation from a milliner that His Grace of Ardrossan intended to remain in the city until Whitsoon. She read the cards aloud at breakfast in the tone of a woman who had been vindicated by history. Margaret listened with the small, composed smile she wore when she was pleased to have been proved desirable, and Iona buttered a piece of toast she did not intend to eat and thought that a duke's calendar had begun to be discussed in Charlotte Square as though it were a public document. He had come to a soirée at the Erskines. He had been seen at the concert rooms. He had walked in Prince's Street Gardens with a book in his coat pocket. He had, according to Aunt Fenella's most reliable source, declined an invitation to Melville Crescent and had accepted an invitation to Charlotte Square. Aunt Fenella laid the card down beside her cup and said, in a voice that had been polished for the occasion, "We shall be quiet on Thursday, only ourselves, and 1 or 2. And Iona understood at once that quiet meant that Margaret was to be given her second interview under conditions Aunt Fenella could stage, and that Iona was to remain visible enough to arrange the flowers and invisible enough not to interfere. She agreed to both, without being asked. She had, in the 7 days since the musical, agreed to a great many things without being asked, and she had drawn the folly of her own composure around herself, as though it were another small octagonal pavilion at the end of a walk, and she had told herself, more often than was quite comfortable, that half a minute at a piano and a look across a violinist's shoulder did not constitute a claim upon anything, least of all upon a woman who had a use in Charlotte Square and no place elsewhere. He came on the Thursday at the hour Aunt Fenella had suggested, and he brought with him a small book bound in dark green calf, which he set on the hall table with the unemphatic care of a man who did not wish his gifts to precede him. Aunt Fenella received him in the drawing room. Margaret was placed by the fire in a chair that had been moved half an inch that afternoon, so that the light would find her cheek at its most sympathetic angle, and Iona was at the far window with a bowl of hyacinths she had been asked to arrange twice already, because Aunt Fenella had not liked the first 2 attempts. Ardrossan bowed. He accepted tea. He did not sit at once. He crossed to the window instead, with the same unhurried care with which he had crossed every threshold Iona had watched him cross, and he stopped a proper 3 feet from her and looked, not at her, at the hyacinths. "They are late this year," he said. "They are," said Iona. "The bulbs were forced too warm and then set out too cool," she added, before she had decided whether to add it. Ardrossan inclined his head. "Someone has been informing you," he said, and there was in the syllable a small, dry note that would have been amusement in another man's voice. "My mother," said Iona, before she had decided whether to say that either. There was a pause of a length she could not measure. He did not look at her. He looked at the hyacinths, he said, at the small volume he had used at the piano, Lockbroom. Iona did not answer. He did not press. He waited as he had waited before the folly drawing, and Iona thought, without meaning to think it, that his waiting was the most restrained thing she had ever been subjected to, and that being restrained toward was a novelty for which she had no vocabulary. She said, at last, "My mother's people were of that country." "Yes, ah," he said, and now the syllable had in it something almost like relief, as though he had held a small question in his mouth for the length of a week and could set it down. He did not ask another. He accepted a second cup of tea from Aunt Fenella when she brought it to him with her own hand, and he crossed to Margaret at the fire and sat where he had been placed, and Iona finished the hyacinths with a hand so steady it surprised her, and thought, small candles, and set the bowl on the table where the light found it, and turned away before the light could find her. Margaret talked. She talked well. Because she had been taught to talk well, she had been given lessons in French, in the reading of a novel, in the small, ready phrases with which a young woman of quality was to encounter the world, and she deployed her instruction with the graceful competence of a woman playing a piece she had practiced. Ardrossan listened. He listened as he did everything, with a stillness that did not press her but did not encourage her either, and Margaret, who had grown accustomed in her 26 years to being encouraged whether or not she asked for it, felt the withholding without being able to name it, and adjusted her voice a fraction higher, and laid her hand for the smallest instant on the arm of his chair, and asked him whether he cared for poetry. He said that he cared for some. She said that she had been reading a volume by Mr. Scott, and had found it very stirring. "Ah," he said. She said that she thought the descriptions of Highland scenery were peculiarly fine. Ardrossan permitted himself, at last, one syllable that was almost a smile. "Mr. Scott," he said, "describes a country he visits." Margaret did not know how to answer that, and laughed instead, and the laugh was pretty, and Aunt Fenella smiled at it, and Iona, at the sideboard now with the tea things, did not smile. She did not, she noticed, feel triumph either. She felt, obscurely and without invitation, sorry for Margaret, who had been drilled all her life in a language whose grammar was insufficient to the present speaker, and who did not know that the language she had been given was too small for the room in which she was now expected to use it. It was not Margaret's fault. It had never been Margaret's fault. It was the accounting of the house, the arithmetic by which Aunt Fenella had decided who was the ornament and who the useful hand, and Margaret had been trained to be the ornament with a diligence for which Iona had once, at 17, envied her. She did not envy her now. She stood at the sideboard, and she counted the teaspoons without needing to, and she waited. He rose to take his leave at the end of the correct interval, and Aunt Fenella walked him to the door, and Margaret went with her, and Iona stayed. She had learned when not to be seen at partings. She heard, in the hall, Aunt Fenella's small pleased farewells, and Margaret's soft laugh at some remark of his that had not quite been a compliment, and she heard the door close, and she heard Aunt Fenella's tread come back along the hall, and she heard the tread pause at the drawing-room threshold and then go past it toward the small parlor where the household letters were sorted, and Iona breathed out. She did not know she had been holding her breath. She was about to cross to the fire to warm her hands when she saw, on the hall table beyond the open drawing-room door, the small book bound in dark green calf that Ardrossan had set down on his arrival. He had not taken it with him. She had watched the taking of leave with a corner of her eye, and she had seen him bow to Aunt Fenella and take Margaret's hand, and he had not lifted the book from the table. It sat there in the lamp, and Iona crossed to it before she had decided to cross to it, because the small parlor was Aunt Fenella's territory, and the hall table was no one's, and she lifted the book with the tips of her fingers and turned the cover open half an inch. Inside the cover, in a hand as economical as its owner, was written her own name. Miss Iona Bruce, in ink the color of dried heather. Beneath the name, at the bottom of the end paper, in the same hand, in 3 words which were neither presented nor withheld, the composer's, not a translator's. She closed the book. She did not read the title on the spine. She did not need to. She stood in the hall with the small green book in her hand, and she felt the small floor of her composure go, this time for longer than half a breath. And she took the book upstairs to her own room and set it on the shelf above the writing table between 2 other books which had been her mother's, and she sat down at the table and pulled a piece of paper toward her, and drew a line across it, and drew another, and the lines resolved themselves, without her permission, into the small octagonal pavilion she had drawn for Mr. Kilbride 18 months before. And she set the pencil down and put her face in her hands for the length of one long breath, and lifted her face again, and pinned her mother's brooch at her throat where it had loosened, and went downstairs to see whether Aunt Fenella needed a letter written. By the following week the story had gone about, in the small ways stories go about in a town in which everyone knew everyone's silversmith. His Grace of Ardrossan had called at Charlotte Square. His Grace of Ardrossan had been observed to speak to Miss Bruce, and then to speak to her again, and then to speak to her a 3rd time at the assembly on Saturday, and each time to speak briefly, and each time to withdraw before it could be called a conversation. His Grace of Ardrossan had, at the Erskine's concert, taken the empty seat at Miss Bruce's left, when he might as easily have taken the empty seat at Miss Margaret Bruce's right. His Grace of Ardrossan had, at an evening party of the Cargills, addressed a remark to Miss Bruce in Gaelic, and Miss Bruce had answered him in the same, and no one else in the room had understood a syllable of the exchange, and the exchange had lasted the length of a candle guttering. It was not attention. It was not, in any of its instances, attention that a woman of Edinburgh could have laid before a magistrate and called attention. It was noticing, and noticing was worse than attention, because attention could be argued with, and noticing could not. Margaret, who had been trained her whole life to be attended to, understood at last that she was being not attended to by the one person in Edinburgh she had permitted herself to think of as a possibility, and she went pale under it in the way a rose goes pale under a night frost, without wilting, without complaining, without ceasing to be a rose. She said nothing to Iona about it. She said, instead, more affectionate things than she had said in 6 months. She kissed the top of Iona's head twice in 1 week. She asked, at breakfast, whether Iona would help her with a bonnet that had never needed help. She lent Iona a shawl, which was, by any standard of the household, the wrong shawl for her, being a shade of coral that made Iona look tired, and she stood behind Iona's chair as Iona tried it on and said, "Oh, my dear, it does not suit you. You must not wear it," and took it away again with an air of concerned tenderness that would have deceived a stranger, and did not deceive Iona at all, because Iona had known Margaret since Margaret was 3 and Iona was 6. And Iona had learned that Margaret was capable of a great many kinds of small violence when Margaret was afraid. Aunt Fenella did not go pale. Aunt Fenella went brisk. Aunt Fenella at breakfast on the Wednesday laid down her cup and said, in the voice she used for accounts, "Iona, my dear, I have been thinking. We have not troubled you overmuch with commissions of late, and I fear you have grown a little idle. There are the copies of the Milanese cousins' letters to be made, and the new subscription list for the society, and I think it best if you took a room upstairs for these next weeks and gave them your proper attention. It will save your coming down and up, and you will not be so much interrupted." Iona set down her toast. She looked at Aunt Fenella across the marmalade. She said, "Of course, Aunt Fenella smiled." "It was," said Aunt Fenella, so like Iona to be obliging. Iona rose and gathered her cup and saucer without a word, and she carried them to the sideboard herself as though she were the parlor maid, and she went upstairs and sat at her writing table and did not weep, because she had learned not to weep at exile disguised as consideration, and she set her hand to the copies of the Milanese cousins' letters, and she thought small candles do more honest work than large lamps, and she thought, this is the honest work. And she did the honest work, and she did not go down to the drawing room that evening when there were visitors. And she was. For 6 days out of the following 10, invisible to any caller at Charlotte Square, and the town, which had been beginning to say the 2 names in a single breath, said only one for a week, and then said, on the strength of Aunt Fenella's 3rd dinner in a fortnight, at which Margaret was placed at his Grace's right, that perhaps the town had been mistaken. His Grace had merely been civil to a poor relation, as one is. His Grace's attentions, properly measured, were where they had always been intended to be. Aunt Fenella's Margaret would, after all, wear a coronet. Ardrossan came to the door of Charlotte Square on the 9th of those 10 days, and he was told by Mrs. Gowan, at Aunt Fenella's instruction, that Miss Bruce was indisposed. He said, "Ah," in the voice with which he had answered Aunt Fenella at supper. He inclined his head to Mrs. Gowan. He left. He did not send a note. He did not send flowers, as another man might have, to signify inquiry. He did nothing. For 2 days, Iona heard from Mrs. Gowan that he had called, and heard from Mrs. Gowan that he had been turned away, and heard from Mrs. Gowan that he had accepted the turning without a change of face, and she thought, at her writing table upstairs, that a man who could accept a lie without flinching was either a fool or a person who intended to test the lie with a colder instrument, and she was not, on the evidence, going to insult him by supposing him a fool. She waited. She copied. She did not go down. On the second evening, she was in the small back parlor that Aunt Fenella had allowed her for her work, and Mrs. Gowan came up with a folded paper and laid it on the table without speaking, and Iona unfolded it, and it was in the economical hand she had already learned to know. It was 2 lines. Miss Bruce, I hope your health is improving. The book on the hall table was yours. I trust it found its shelf. Ardrossan, she folded the paper. She put it into the drawer of the writing table under a sheet of blotting. She wrote, on a sheet of her own paper, 3 lines. Your Grace, I am much recovered, and the book found its shelf. I thank you. I, Bruce, she sealed it with the small wafer she used for household notes. She gave it to Mrs. Gowan and said, please see that it goes tonight. Mrs. Gowan, who had been in the house since before Iona had come to it, looked at Iona for a long moment. She said nothing. She took the note. She went out. Iona sat at the writing table with her hands folded in her lap, and she thought. With the ironic clarity that had been her chief companion for 10 years, that she had just, without meaning to, told a duke that she was not indisposed, and she thought, without irony, that she was very glad she had told him. By the following morning, Aunt Fenella knew. It did not signify how she knew. Mrs. Gowan had said nothing, and had not been asked. Aunt Fenella knew because Aunt Fenella had spent 30 years learning to know the small currents in her own house, and she knew, and she came into the small back parlor before breakfast in the ivory shawl she wore when she wished to be thought fragile. And she sat down without being asked, and she said, in the voice she used for the arranging of the world, Iona, my dear, we must have a small conversation. Iona set down her pen. She turned in her chair. Aunt Fenella arranged her rings. Aunt Fenella said, in the voice, His Grace has been most obliging in his attentions to Margaret, and it will not do to have him confused. Iona said nothing. Aunt Fenella said, you are a sensible girl, Iona, and you have always been sensible about small vanities, and I know that you will understand me. His Grace has been kind to you because he is a gentleman, and because your mother's people were of that country, it is a courtesy he owes to old names, and it is not to be misconstrued. Iona said, I have not misconstrued it. Aunt Fenella smiled. Of course you have not, she said, but you will forgive me, my dear, if I ask you to be quite plain in the matter. If he calls again, you will be indisposed. If he speaks to you in company, you will answer briefly and turn to another. If he writes to you, and I am told he has written to you, you will bring the letter to me, and I shall answer it on your behalf, as is proper for a young woman in your position. Iona did not lower her eyes. She did not raise them either. She looked at the small piece of paper on her writing table on which she had begun the day's copying, and she said, at the small volume she had learned to use when she meant to be heard exactly, no, Aunt Fenella went very still. She said, I beg your pardon. Iona said, I shall not be indisposed if I am not. I shall answer if I am spoken to. I shall not bring my letters to you. I have not written a letter that you might not read, and I do not intend to write one. But I shall not bring my letters to you. Aunt Fenella looked at her for the length of a breath. Aunt Fenella said, in a voice from which the ivory shawl had gone, I see. Then she rose. She rearranged the ivory shawl about her shoulders. She said, we shall speak of this again, and she went out. Iona sat at her writing table. She did not tremble. She took up her pen. She wrote the next Italian courtesy in her clean, small hand. She thought, small candles. She thought, I have just decided something, and she thought, I did not know I had decided it until I said it, and she thought, that too is familiar. That is how deciding is done. The letter came on the Friday. It came by the morning post, and Mrs. Gowan brought it up on a small salver to the drawing room, where Aunt Fenella and Margaret were sitting after breakfast, and Aunt Fenella looked at the direction and did not recognize the hand, and opened it herself, as she opened all letters that came to Charlotte Square, and read it, and her face did a thing that Iona, from the doorway with a bowl of hyacinths, had not seen it do in 10 years. It went yellow at the temples. It went white at the mouth. It read the letter through a second time. It folded the letter with hands that had gone unsteady, and it looked up at Margaret, and it looked past Margaret at Iona in the doorway, and it said, in a voice from which the drawing room had gone, "Come in and close the door." Iona set the bowl on the sideboard and closed the door. Margaret rose. Aunt Fenella said, "Sit down." Margaret sat. Aunt Fenella laid the letter on the table. She said, "This is an anonymous letter directed to me. It concerns Iona." "It is," she said, and here her voice went dry, "of a nature I shall not repeat in this room." Iona said, "May I read it?" Aunt Fenella looked at her. Aunt Fenella pushed the letter across the polished mahogany. Iona took it up and read it. It was not long. It was one sheet of good paper in a careful hand that had been carefully disguised, the loops a little too round, the down strokes a little too heavy, the ink a shade too new. It said that Miss Iona Bruce, of Charlotte Square, was known to certain persons in the town to have been, some years past, at Lochbroom, the object of an attachment of a nature the writer would not name, and that she had at that time forfeited the good name that Charlotte Square had generously permitted her to bear, and that Aunt Fenella would do well to know, before she permitted Miss Bruce to be introduced further into the notice of persons of quality, that Miss Bruce had a history which no woman of Miss Bruce's present station could bear scrutiny of. It was signed, "A Friend of the Family." Iona read it twice. She set it down on the table. She said, in the small, even voice that had become her weapon, "This is a lie." Aunt Fenella looked at her. Aunt Fenella said, "My dear, it is signed a friend of the family." Iona said, "It is a lie, Aunt. I was 17 at Lochbroom, and my mother was dying, and I sat with her at nights, and I did not leave the house from November until March, and I did not know a man of the country except our factor, who was 60 and a widower and drank tea with me at 3 in the afternoon after his round. There was no attachment, there was no forfeit, there was nothing." Aunt Fenella said, "I have not accused you." Iona said, "You have not accused me, Aunt, but you have read this letter with an expression that told me you were willing to be persuaded, and you will forgive me if I say so." Aunt Fenella closed her eyes for a moment. Aunt Fenella opened them. She said, "We shall not act on it. We shall lay it aside. We shall speak of it to no one." Iona said, "No." Aunt Fenella said, "No," Iona said. "We shall not lay it aside. We shall discover who wrote it. If we lay it aside, it will be sent to another house, and to another, until it reaches a house that will act on it, and I shall have no name in the town by Whitsoon." Aunt Fenella said nothing. Margaret said nothing. Margaret was very white. Iona looked at her. She did not accuse her. She looked at her only long enough to see what she needed to see, and she saw it, and she looked away. She said, "Aunt, I shall write to my grandmother." Lady Bruce of Kinidar, who was Iona's father's mother, and had been widowed at 40, and had run the small estate of Kinidar herself for 32 years since, was in her 73rd year, and did not travel to Edinburgh in the spring, because the spring did not suit her chest, but she read her letters at 8 in the morning after her tea. And she read Iona's letter on the Monday morning at 8, and she was in her traveling coach with her maid by 2 in the afternoon, and she was in the drawing room at Charlotte Square by 7 the following evening. She came in as she had come in twice in Iona's life, once at Iona's mother's funeral, and once at Iona's father's, in black, without ornament, with the small pearl at her throat that had been her own mother's, and she stopped just inside the drawing room and looked at Aunt Fenella with an expression from which the drawing room went silent for a length of time that Aunt Fenella afterward could not have measured. "Fenella," said Lady Bruce, in a voice that had not risen above a low speaking tone in 50 years, and had not needed to. Aunt Fenella rose. Aunt Fenella said, "Lady Bruce, this is an unexpected pleasure." "It is not a pleasure," said Lady Bruce, "and it is not unexpected if you have any sense of what has been done in this house. Where is my granddaughter?" Iona came in from the small back parlor, and Lady Bruce looked at her for the length of a breath, and then held out her hand, and Iona crossed to her, and Lady Bruce took Iona's hand and did not release it. "Sit down," said Lady Bruce to Aunt Fenella. Aunt Fenella sat down. Lady Bruce sat down on the sofa beside Iona and did not release her hand. She said, "Show me the letter." Aunt Fenella brought the letter. Lady Bruce read it in one pass and set it on her lap. She said, "My grandchild was at Lochbroom in the winter of 1801, because my daughter-in-law was dying there, and my grandchild sat with her every night for 19 weeks, and I was in the house for 11 of those weeks, and I know what my grandchild did and did not do in those 19 weeks better than the writer of this letter does. And the writer of this letter is either a liar or a fool, and I do not think, on the evidence of the hand, that the writer is a fool." She turned to Iona. She said, "Do you know who wrote it?" Iona said, "No, grandmother." Lady Bruce said, "Do you suspect who wrote it?" Iona said, "I do not wish to name a person on a suspicion." Lady Bruce said, "That is a proper answer, and I withdraw the question." She turned to the letter. She held it up to the lamp. She looked at it a long moment. She said, "Fenella, be so good as to bring me the last 3 letters you have received from the milliner in George Street." Aunt Fenella said, "From Mrs. Angus." Lady Bruce said, "Yes." Aunt Fenella went out. Lady Bruce did not release Iona's hand. She looked at Iona and said, at the small volume she had used all Iona's life for the sentences that mattered, "My dear, it will be well." Iona said, "Grandmother." Lady Bruce said, "Small candles," and Iona bent her head, because her mother had learned that sentence from her mother's mother, and Iona had not remembered until that moment that the sentence had come from Kinadar, and she thought, "Small candles do more honest work than large lamps," and she thought, "One of them is at my elbow." Aunt Fenella brought Mrs. Angus's 3 letters. Lady Bruce laid them on the low table and laid the anonymous letter beside them. She held the lamp close. She looked at the anonymous letter. She looked at Mrs. Angus's letters. She looked at the anonymous letter again. She said, "Fenella, this is not Mrs. Angus." Aunt Fenella said, "I had not thought it was." Lady Bruce said, "It is written on Mrs. Angus's paper. Do you see the small watermark? It is a paper Mrs. Angus has from her cousin in Perth, and I know it because I have had 4 of her bills on it, and it is not sold in Edinburgh. It comes to her by the packet. Whoever wrote this letter has been in Mrs. Angus's back room." Aunt Fenella said, "Or has had a piece from her ledger." Lady Bruce said, "Or has been in the writing box of a person to whom Mrs. Angus has sent a bill within the past 6 weeks." Aunt Fenella went white. She said nothing. Lady Bruce said, "There is another matter." She held the anonymous letter to the lamp. "The writer," she said, "has spelled Lochbroom with a K. Look." She held the paper closer. Iona looked. The writer had spelled Lochbroom, Lochbroom. It was in the 3rd line of the letter. It was in a hand that had otherwise done its best to be careful. It was a mistake such as an Edinburgh person who had never been to the country might make, and it was a mistake such as no Highlander would ever make, and it was, more particularly, a mistake such as one person in Charlotte Square habitually made and had been chided for by Iona at 17 when she had first come to the house, and that person had never learned the correction. Iona looked at her aunt. She did not look at Margaret. Aunt Fenella did not look at Margaret either. There was a silence in the room such as a room makes when a room has begun to understand a thing. Lady Bruce said, at the small volume she had used all Iona's life, "There it is." She set the letter down. She said, "Fenella, be so good as to ring for the maid. I shall want tea." Aunt Fenella rang. The maid came. Tea was ordered. The maid went out. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap. Margaret said nothing. Margaret's face had gone the pale of a rose after a frost, and this time she wilted only a little, only at the shoulders, and she did not lift her eyes. Lady Bruce did not look at her. Lady Bruce said, "Iona, my dear, you will come with me to Kinidar for a fortnight while this is being seen to. You will pack a small trunk tonight, and we shall go tomorrow at 10. Aunt Fenella opened her mouth. Aunt Fenella closed it. Lady Bruce said, without turning her head, "Fenella, that is not a proposal to be discussed. That is the arrangement." The tea came. Lady Bruce drank hers. Iona drank hers. Aunt Fenella drank hers with the concentration of a woman keeping a hand steady in the presence of a witness. Margaret did not drink hers. When the tea was done, Lady Bruce rose, and Iona rose with her, and Iona went up to pack the small trunk, and Lady Bruce remained in the drawing room. Iona did not hear what was said in the drawing room between her grandmother and her aunt. She heard only, once, Lady Bruce's voice at the small volume, and once, Aunt Fenella's voice not at any volume at all. When Iona came down at 10 the following morning, Margaret was at the door of the drawing room and did not come out to say goodbye, and Aunt Fenella was in the hall in the ivory shawl, and Aunt Fenella took Iona's hand in a manner Iona had not felt in 10 years, and said, "My dear, forgive me," and Iona said, "Aunt," and did not say more, because she had not, in the 12 hours since the lamp had shown the K in Lockbroom, decided what she thought about her aunt, and she was not going to pretend to have decided in the hall. Kinidar was in a country that did not pretend to be anything but itself, low green hills going gray where the wind took them, a house of gray stone with a stepped gable, and a garden Lady Bruce had planted 40 years before and had never permitted a gardener to alter, and a fire in every room that mattered, and a kitchen that smelled of oatmeal and coriander seed and the particular scent of a bread that was baked in a bricked oven twice a week. Iona had been there 4 times in her life. She had felt each time that she had come home to a house that was not hers, and was, in some way, she could not name, more hers than any house she had lived in. Lady Bruce did not, in the fortnight, speak to Iona of the letter. Lady Bruce spoke to Iona of the garden, of the tenants, of a mare that had foaled in March, of a book by a Frenchwoman that she had been reading in the evenings, of the sermon at the small kirk on the Sunday, of a small octagonal pavilion which she had once thought to build at the end of the walk, and had never troubled to build. And Iona sat with her in the mornings in the small drawing room that faced east, and Iona drew, for the first time in 18 months, drawings that had her own name at their foot. She drew the pavilion, she drew the herb bed by the kitchen door, she drew the mare and the foal. She drew, one evening when Lady Bruce had gone to bed, a face she had not intended to draw, and she looked at the face for a long moment, and she tore the paper across, and she burned the pieces in the fire, and she went to bed. It was not admiration, not yet, but recognition, and she was, at Kinidar, no longer able to pretend to herself that she did not know the difference. On the 6th day of the fortnight, a letter came for Lady Bruce, and Lady Bruce read it at the breakfast table, and set it down, and said, "At the small volume Iona, His Grace of Ardrisson has written to me." Iona set down her cup. Lady Bruce said, "He has heard, by what channel I do not know, that you are with me at Kinadar, and he asks whether he may pay his respects, if it is not inconvenient." Iona said, "Nothing." Lady Bruce said, "I shall answer that it is not inconvenient, and that he may come on the Thursday to dine, if he can bring himself over the pass by 4. Iona said, "Grandmother." Lady Bruce said, "My dear, I am 73, and I have very little patience left for the arranging of small vanities. He has been to Lochbroom in his own person twice since Christmas, on a matter to which we shall come. He knows the country. He knows the name. He knows, I have every reason to believe, more of your mother's affairs than either of us has hitherto known, and I have been waiting for him to say so. I shall have him at my table on Thursday, and you shall be at my table on Thursday, and we shall see what is to be seen." Iona said, "Grandmother, may I ask what you mean about my mother's affairs?" Lady Bruce set her cup down. Lady Bruce said, "My dear, your mother was Myrie Mackenzie of Lochbroom, and Myrie Mackenzie of Lochbroom was the sole heir of her father, and her father's lands were larger than any of us was ever permitted to speak of in your Aunt Fenella's house. They were larger than any of us thought fit to press on you as a girl, because your father, God rest him, wished you not to be an heiress before you were a person, and I have kept the counsel of my son in that as in other things. But your mother's lands are not gone. They have been held in trust by Mackenzie of Coigach these 10 years for you, and it is time you understood the shape of them, and it is time others understood the shape of them, and I have reason to think His Grace of Ardrisson understands them better than we do, because his estate marches with 2 of the largest of them at their northern end, and he has been quietly buying, this last year, the leases of tenants your factor has been mishandling. He has not written to me of it. He has been waiting to be asked. I shall ask him on Thursday." She lifted her cup. She drank. She said, "My dear, close your mouth." Iona closed her mouth. Lady Bruce said, "Small candles," and Iona said, "Grandmother, I do not know what to think." Lady Bruce said, "You will know by Thursday evening." Iona said, "Grandmother." Lady Bruce said, "Yes," Iona said, "does he know?" Lady Bruce said, "He knows what he has seen with his own eyes, which is that half of the coast from Ullapool to Loch Yeo is under a young woman's name he had not connected to a Miss Bruce of Charlotte Square until a certain evening in April, when he heard your Aunt Fenella lie about Lochbroom at her own supper table. He has known since April. He has not moved. That, my dear, tells you what you need to know about him for the moment." Iona did not answer. She looked at the tablecloth. She thought, half of the coast. She thought, small candles. She thought, he has known since April. Thursday was fine, which was not to be counted upon in that country in that season, and Lady Bruce had a fire in the drawing-room and a table laid for 4, because she had asked also the minister of the small kirk and his sister, out of a sense that a duke ought not to be dined alone at a house of women, and Iona was in a gown of the same nameless grey she had worn in Edinburgh, with her mother's brooch at her throat, and Lady Bruce was in black with the small pearl. The coach came over the pass at 3:30 and along the drive at 4 exactly, and Lady Bruce was in the hall in person to receive him, which she had done for no one in 9 years, and Ardrisson came in with the coat of a man who had ridden 3 days, and a face which had not permitted itself to show it, and he bowed to Lady Bruce with the exact bow he owed her, and no more. And Lady Bruce inclined her head with the exact inclination she owed him and no more, and they looked at one another for the length of a breath in perfect understanding, and Lady Bruce said, "Your Grace," and Ardrossan said, "Lady Bruce," and Ardrossan turned his head, and his eyes found Iona in the drawing-room doorway, and this time he did not look away. He crossed to her. He did not offer his hand. He stopped at the proper distance. He said, at the small volume he used only for her, "Miss Bruce." She said, at the same volume, "Your Grace." He looked at her a moment longer than was quite polite in the hearing of a grandmother. He said, "I hope your health is much recovered." She said, "Entirely, thank you." He inclined his head. He turned to Lady Bruce. He said, "Lady Bruce, I have brought a small packet of papers which I should be glad to lay before you after dinner, if you will permit." Lady Bruce said, "I have been waiting for them, Your Grace." Ardrossan permitted the ghost of a smile. He said, "I had thought so." Dinner was quiet. The minister spoke well of the sermon he had preached the Sunday before, and did not press it upon anyone, and his sister spoke of a jelly which had not set, and Ardrossan spoke of the road, and Lady Bruce spoke of a book, and Iona spoke when spoken to, and did not speak otherwise, and the meal was over in an hour and a half. And the minister and his sister were seen out with the small courtesy Lady Bruce showed to persons who understood when they were being useful, and when they were being politely dismissed, and Lady Bruce led Ardrossan and Iona into the small library at the back of the house, where the fire had been made up and the shutters closed. And she sat in her own chair by the fire, and she said, "Your Grace." The papers. Ardrossan set on the table a slim leather portfolio. He opened it. He said, at the small volume, "Lady Bruce, Miss Bruce." He drew out a sheet. He said, "This is a copy, made by my own hand, of a memorandum drawn up in 1801 by Mackenzie of Koigak for the trust of Myrie Mackenzie's lands." He drew out another. He said, "This is a schedule of leases granted since the death of Myrie Mackenzie's husband to persons who ought not to have been granted them, and at rents which ought not to have been permitted." He drew out a third. He said, "This is a list of the monies received into the trust in the 10 years since, and of the monies disbursed, and I regret to say that the two lists do not agree." He drew out a fourth. He said, "This is a letter I received last month from a factor of my own, who has been in the country of Koigak on my business, in which he informs me that a man in Edinburgh has been buying up small parcels of paper on Mackenzie of Koigak at a discount, and that the man in Edinburgh is not Mackenzie of Koigak's creditor of record." He set the sheets down. He looked at Iona. He said, at the small volume, "Miss Bruce, half the coast from Ullapool to Loch Ewe stands in your name, and a man in Edinburgh has been quietly acquiring the means to press an old debt against your trustee, such that he might, at a moment of his choosing, force a sale of the lands at a price which would ruin you, and he has, I have reason to believe, been the person to arrange the anonymous letter which was received in Charlotte Square a fortnight past." He did not name the man. He did not need to. He said, "I have not yet moved against him, because I did not wish to move without your leave, and I did not wish to move without your grandmother's counsel, and I did not wish, if you will forgive my saying so, to move at all before you knew what was yours." He set his hand on the papers. He said, "It is yours, Miss Bruce, every acre, and the man in Edinburgh will not have it." Iona did not answer. She looked at the papers. She looked at Ardrossan. Lady Bruce said, at the small volume, "Your Grace, thank you." Ardrossan inclined his head. He said, "Lady Bruce, I am glad to have been of use." Lady Bruce said, "Will you take a glass of something?" Ardrossan said, "No, thank you." Lady Bruce said, "Then you will forgive me if I leave you and my granddaughter to speak for a quarter of an hour in the library, while I take my constitutional at the end of the walk. It is a fine evening, and I shall not be gone longer. She rose. She looked at Iona for a moment. She said, "Small candles, my dear." She went out. The door closed behind her. The fire settled. Outside, the wind lifted and came down again against the shuttered window, with the small, persistent pressure of a hand asking to be let in, and Ardrossan looked at Iona across the papers on the low table, and Iona looked at Ardrossan, and neither of them moved. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had waited at the door of Charlotte Square and at the piano in a drawing room in George Street, and before a folly drawing in the morning room of Melville Crescent, and he had learned, Iona thought, that a door opened in its own time, or it did not open, and that the persons worth entering to were the persons who had chosen to open. She looked at the papers on the low table. She looked at the fire. She said, "At the small volume, Your Grace, I do not know how to thank you." Ardrossan said, "At the same volume, you are not required to thank me." Iona said, "I am not accustomed to being told what I am not required to do." Ardrossan permitted, for the first time in her hearing, something that in a lesser man would have been a smile. He said, "I have observed as much." He did not move from his chair. He said, "Miss Bruce, I owe you a plain statement, and I shall make it, and then I shall leave you to your grandmother, and I shall come again, or not, as you direct." He set his hands on his knees. He said, "When I heard the word lockbroom at your aunt's supper table, I heard also the small silence with which you did not correct her, and I understood that the silence was old and that you had bought it dearly. I made inquiry. I did not make inquiry to spy upon you. I made inquiry because I had ridden past a coast in April on my way south, and I had seen a shore in disrepair, and I had asked whose it was, and the name I was given was a name I had not connected to you, and when I connected it, I could not, in conscience, unconnect it. I have not spoken because I did not wish to speak until I had a plain account to lay before you. I have that account tonight." He looked at the papers. He said, "I have another statement which I have deferred until the first was made, because I did not wish the two to be confused." He looked at her. He said, "Miss Bruce, I have not called at Charlotte Square because I hoped to marry your cousin. I have not sat at your aunt's right because I found her conversation instructive. I have called because you were in the house, and I wished to see you, and I have sat where I sat because I was placed there, and I have not placed myself elsewhere because I did not wish to put a face upon a private matter until the private matter had been set on such ground as I could offer it. That is my statement. I shall not press it upon you. I shall not press anything upon you. I have said it because it would be dishonest to leave you in ignorance of it while you decide whether I may come again." Iona did not answer. She looked at him. She looked at the fire. She said, "At the small volume, Your Grace, I heard you at the piano, and I heard you in the morning room of Melville Crescent, and I received your book, and I read your 2 lines, and I answered them. And my aunt has read this evening's account of my mother's lands with a face which will not soon leave me, and I have not, in the 11 days since I left Edinburgh, been able to think of any of these things without thinking of one other, and I do not yet know what that other is. I shall know. I do not know tonight." He said, "I have not asked you to know tonight." She said, "No, you have not." Ardrossan rose. He said, "I shall take my leave." He looked at the papers. He said, "These are copies for you. The originals are lodged with a firm in Edinburgh whose name I shall send to Lady Bruce. Miss Bruce." He bowed. He turned. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the door. He did not open it. He said, "Without turning, Miss Bruce, forgive me one further indulgence." He said, "At the small volume, the drawing in Melville Crescent is very fine. He opened the door. He went out. Iona sat by the fire for a long moment, and she looked at the papers, and she looked at the door, and she thought, small candles, and she thought, one of them has just walked out of the room, and she thought, that is not the same as leaving. By the following morning, the country had begun to be spoken of in Edinburgh in a way it had not been spoken of before, because Lady Bruce had written 5 letters at 8 the previous evening and had put them into the mail by 9, and one of the letters had gone to Mackenzie of Coigach with instruction to attend upon her at Kinnadar within the week. And one had gone to a firm of solicitors in Edinburgh who had done business with the Bruce family since the century turned, and one had gone to a certain Mr. Kilbride of Melville Crescent to inform him that a matter had arisen which required him to remove a plate from a frame in his morning room and to have another engraved in its place, and one had gone to Aunt Fenella. And one had gone to a gentleman in Edinburgh whom Ardrossan had, without naming, named Mackenzie of Coigach, came on the Saturday. He was a small, tidy man of 60 with an anxious mouth, and he sat with Lady Bruce for 4 hours in the small library and left the house at 4 in the afternoon, looking as though he had ridden through weather. He did not speak to Iona. He was not asked to. On the Monday, a note came from the firm in Edinburgh to Lady Bruce, in which it was stated that the anonymous letter received at Charlotte Square had been traced, upon comparison with certain papers in the firm's possession, to the hand of a clerk in the employ of the gentleman Ardrossan had named, and that the clerk had, upon being spoken to at some length, given up his master, and that the master had, upon being informed of the clerk's statement, called his carriage to Leith and put himself upon the packet to Rotterdam within 12 hours, and that a warrant for his arrest was expected to be issued on the Wednesday. It was noted, in a postscript in a different hand, that the gentleman's absence from Edinburgh had already been remarked upon in 3 drawing-rooms, and that Charlotte Square was one of them. Iona read the note over her grandmother's shoulder and did not speak. Lady Bruce folded it. Lady Bruce said, "At the small volume, my dear, I hope you will not now insist that the world sees only what is convenient to it." Iona said, "No, grandmother," Lady Bruce said, "Good," and rose, and went to write another letter. Ardrossan did not come again to Kinnadar in that fortnight. He wrote once to Lady Bruce to say that he had gone north to see for himself that certain leases had been correctly withdrawn and certain factors correctly dismissed, and that he would return to Edinburgh by the 12th, and that he hoped, if it was not inconvenient, to call at Charlotte Square upon Miss Bruce upon such day as Miss Bruce named, and no other. Lady Bruce showed Iona the letter, and Iona read it, and folded it, and set it on the table, and said, "At the small volume, the 20th, grandmother," and Lady Bruce said, "The 20th," and wrote a line under her hand, and sealed it. And Iona went out to the garden, and stood for a long time under the yew tree at the end of the walk, and thought that a woman of 29 who had spent 10 years learning not to want a thing did not unlearn the not wanting in a fortnight, and thought also that it was time she began. She returned to Charlotte Square on the 17th in her grandmother's coach, and Lady Bruce came with her, because Lady Bruce had said that she would not have Iona set into that house alone with the letter still fresh on the drawing-room table, and Aunt Fenella received them in the hall with the ivory shawl, and with a face on which a fortnight's understanding had rearranged the small vanities into something quieter. She took Iona's hand. She said, "My dear." She did not say the rest. Iona said, "Aunt." She did not say the rest either. Margaret was at the drawing-room door in a gown the color of a gray pearl, and Margaret looked at Iona and did not step forward, and Iona looked at Margaret and did not step forward, and Lady Bruce, who saw everything, permitted the 2 young women the small dignity of not being forced to embrace in a hall, and she said, "Fenella, "I shall take a cup of tea if you have any," and led Aunt Fenella by the elbow into the drawing room. Iona and Margaret were left in the hall. Margaret said, "At the small volume." "Iona," Iona said. "At the same volume." "Margaret," Margaret said. "I did not write it." Iona said, "I know." Margaret said, "I let it be read." Iona said, "I know that also." Margaret said, "I am sorry." It was not a well-made apology. It had no rhetoric and no phrase. It was the sound of a woman who had been trained in a language too small for the present sentence and had, at last, chosen the plain word she had. Iona looked at her. Iona said, "At the small volume, Margaret. I forgive you tonight, because if I do not forgive you tonight, I shall have to forgive you tomorrow, and I would rather be done with it." Margaret's eyes filled. She did not lift her hand. She said, "Thank you." Iona said, "Do not make me sorry I said so." Margaret said, "I shall not," and turned, and went upstairs. She kept her word. She was afterward, for the rest of her life, careful of Iona in small ways that made the affection between them into a slighter but truer thing, and she married, in the following autumn, a mild widower with an income in Peebles and 2 small daughters who came to love her, and she was, on the whole, happier than she had been in Charlotte Square, and she never again lent Iona a shawl. The 20th was a Thursday, and by 3 in the afternoon the sky over Edinburgh had begun to darken from the west with the deliberate slowness of weather that has decided to be itself, and by 5 it was raining in earnest, and by 7 the wind had come up along Princes Street and was pressing at the shutters of Charlotte Square as though the house had personally offended it. Aunt Fenella had, at Lady Bruce's instruction, arranged that there should be no other callers in the house that evening, and had gone with Margaret to sit with Mrs. Cargill in York Place, and Lady Bruce had gone to the small parlor at the back, with a book and a lamp and a piece of embroidery she had not touched in 6 years, and did not intend to touch now. And Iona was in the drawing room, with the fire made up and the lamps low, and she was wearing the same nameless gray she had worn all season, with her mother's brooch at her throat, and she had at 7:30 taken the small green book down from the shelf in her own room and brought it downstairs, and she had set it on the low table beside the fire, and she had sat, and she had waited. Ardrossan came at 8. He came on foot, because the coach could not turn easily in the square in that weather, and he came without a hat because the hat had been given up as a loss in Princes Street, and his coat was black with rain, and Mrs. Gowan took the coat in the hall with the small tender care of a woman who had lived through a great many arrivals and had learned which arrivals to be tender toward. And Ardrossan crossed the hall in his shirt-sleeves and his waistcoat and his black neckcloth, and he stopped at the drawing-room door, and he said, "At the small volume, Miss Bruce." Iona rose. She said, "Your Grace." She looked at him. She said, "At the same volume, you are wet through." He said, "I am." She said, "Come to the fire." He came. He stopped at the proper distance from the fire, which was also, by the accident of the room, the proper distance from her. He did not sit. He said, "Miss Bruce, I have crossed a great deal of country in 12 days, and I have thought a great deal, and I have not, at any point in the 12 days, been able to prevent myself thinking of one thing." He looked at the fire. He said, "I did not come because you had lands." He looked at the fire. He said, "I did not come because your grandmother is a formidable woman, and my uncle knew her at 16 and told me she was to be respected." He looked at the fire. He said, "I did not come because Edinburgh has been talking, and Edinburgh will talk of whatever I do, and it is nothing to me what Edinburgh talks of." He looked at her. He said, "I came because I wanted to see you when no one was watching." He came a step closer. He said, "Miss Bruce, In the first week of April, I stood in a room in George Street, and I heard a woman lie about a country I love, and I saw a woman at the far end of the room not lift her eyes from a plate, and I saw the small candle of her composure burn steadily and unremarked. And I have not, since that evening, been able to warm myself at any other fire. He came another step. He said, I do not know when I began to love you. I know that I did not know it in April. I know that I knew it in the morning room of Melville Crescent. I know that I have known it every day since, and that I have not spoken, because I did not wish to speak until I could offer you what you were owed. And now I have offered you what you were owed, and I have nothing left to withhold. And I am afraid I shall shame myself in a drawing room if you do not, in a moment, tell me either to speak or to be silent. He stopped. He was, Iona saw, breathing rather more quickly than a man of his composure permitted himself to breathe. His voice, which had been the voice of a duke in a drawing room, had shed the rank in it somewhere between the door and the fire, and it was, at that distance, only the voice of a man who had come out of the rain to a room in which a woman he loved was sitting, and he did not know, yet, whether he was to be told to sit down. Iona looked at him. She did not step toward him. She did not lift her hand. She said, at the small volume that had become her weapon, Your Grace. He waited. She said, Your Grace, I have spent 10 years in this house being told, by kind people and by unkind, what was owed to me and what was not, and I have learned, in those 10 years, to accept the accounting and not to argue with it, and I have come home from Kinidar with an accounting I did not expect, and I am not, tonight, in a position to accept another accounting from another person, however kindly it is offered. She looked at him. She said, If you are asking me to marry you tonight because I have half of a coast in my name, I shall thank you and refuse you. If you are asking me because I have been ill-used, and you are the sort of man who cannot bear to see a woman ill-used and not repair it, I shall thank you and refuse you. If you are asking me because Edinburgh has begun to speak of us in the same breath, and you are a man of honor and cannot bear to leave a name uncovered, I shall thank you and refuse you. She stopped. She looked at the fire. She said, at the small volume, If you are asking me because you have discovered, in the last 12 days, that you cannot warm yourself at any other fire, then you may ask again in a fortnight, when I have had a fortnight in which to know whether I can warm myself at yours, and I shall give you an answer that will bear the weight of the asking. He stood very still. He did not step closer. He did not step back. He said, at this small volume, Miss Bruce, I shall come again in a fortnight, and I shall ask again. And I shall ask on the terms you have just described, and I shall not, in the fortnight, presume upon a syllable of what I have said tonight. He inclined his head. He said, Thank you. He turned. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the door. He did not open it. He said without turning, Miss Bruce, the drawing in Melville Crescent has had its plate changed. Mr. Kilbride was informed on Monday the new plate is being engraved this week. Iona did not answer. He opened the door. He went out. She heard him in the hall. She heard Mrs. Gowan bring the coat. She heard the front door close. She heard the wind come down against the shutters as if it had been waiting for him to leave the house to test her composure without a witness. She sat down on the sofa. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the fire. She thought, small candles. She thought, I have just told a duke to come back in a fortnight, and I have meant it, and she thought, at last, and only then, and briefly, and without shame, and with the clean quietness of truth reaching a surface it had been trying for 10 years to reach, and she wept once into her own steady hands, and she wiped her face, and she pinned the brooch at her throat where it had loosened, and she went to the small parlor to tell her grandmother that his grace had gone. He came again on the 4th of the following month, which was a Wednesday, and Aunt Fenella was in the drawing-room in the ivory shawl for the sake of the courtesy, and Lady Bruce was in the small parlor at the back with a book she was not reading, and Iona was in the drawing-room in the same nameless gray, and Ardrossan came in without rain on his coat, and he crossed to Iona, and he bowed. And he said, "Miss Bruce." She said, "Your Grace." Aunt Fenella rose. Aunt Fenella said, "I shall see whether Mrs. Gowan has the tea," and went out and closed the door, which was a courtesy Aunt Fenella had never before shown to any caller, and Iona did not look at the door because she did not need to. Ardrossan did not sit. He said, "At the small volume, Miss Bruce, I asked you a question a fortnight ago in a form you would not accept. I ask it now in the form you named." He said, "I do not ask because you have lands. I do not ask because you have been ill-used. I do not ask because Edinburgh speaks." He said, "I ask because I have discovered that I cannot warm myself at any other fire, and because I wish to be at your fire when no one is watching, and because I wish you at mine on the same terms, and I ask now, and I shall not ask again unless you tell me I may." He waited. Iona rose. She did not step toward him. She said at the small volume, "Your Grace." She said yes, because I wish it. He did not move. He said at the small volume, "Thank you." He said at the same volume, "May I?" She said, yes. He crossed the small remaining distance. He did not take her in his arms. He lifted her hand from her side, and he held it in both of his, and he did not let it go. He did not, for a long time, say anything else. She did not, for a long time, need him to. It was not the moment for the speech of it. It was the moment for the hand, and the hand was enough. She stood beside him, not before him, and he stood beside her, not before her, and the fire settled. And outside the wind, which had blown all day, went down at last to a small, even breeze at the window that had, at that hour, nothing to prove. They were married on the 12th of June in the small kirk at Kinnadar, because Lady Bruce did not consider Edinburgh a suitable venue for a wedding of any granddaughter of hers who had been ill-used in Edinburgh, and because Ardrossan had said, at the small volume, that a country wedding suited him, and because Iona had said, at the same volume, that she wished to be married in the country where her mother's brooch had first been pinned at her mother's own throat by her mother's mother. And it was so arranged. Aunt Fenella and Margaret came, and Mackenzie of Coigach came, and the tenants came in from the coast in wagons, because word had gone about that the young mistress of the country was to be married, and that the young mistress had returned to them, and the small kirk was full, and the small green pavilion at the end of the walk at Kinnadar, which Lady Bruce had asked Iona to draw, and which had been built in a fortnight by 3 men from the village, stood with its lantern lit in the June evening for the wedding supper, and Iona wore a gown of a color that had a name, a pale blue that was not the pale blue of Margaret's ballrooms, but the pale blue of a highland sky in the last hour before dawn, and she wore her mother's brooch at her throat, and Ardrossan stood beside her, not before her, and the minister who had eaten Lady Bruce's dinner on the Thursday of the papers married them in 20 minutes and did not preach, because the minister had understood, in the interval, what he had been permitted to witness, and he preached instead in the following Sunday sermon, briefly, on the text that a small candle does more honest work than a large lamp, without naming a person in the parish, and no one in the parish needed to be named. By the following spring, the coast from Ullapool to Loch Yeo had begun to be spoken of in Edinburgh in a way it had not been spoken of in the memory of any living person, because the leases had been reformed and the rents had been set at figures the tenants could pay, and the small piers had been mended, and a new school had been built at Coigach with slates for the children and a schoolmistress, who was paid a proper wage, and a small hospital had been founded at Ullapool with 2 doctors and 4 beds, and a woman who was to be housekeeper and whose husband had been one of the factors previously dismissed, and who had been given honest work in place of the dishonest work he had been forced to, and it had been remarked by more than one gentleman in the new town that the Duchess of Ardrossan had a hand in every one of these arrangements, and it had been remarked further by more than one lady that the Duchess of Ardrossan drew every plan she signed off on herself, in a hand which had a small octagonal signature at its foot, which had begun to appear at the head of buildings from Loch Broom to Loch Ewe. And Mr. Alexander Kilbride of Melville Crescent, who was a man of small courage and small conscience, had informed his neighbors over dinner that he had, in fact, always known that the folly at the end of his walk had been drawn by Miss Bruce, and that he had been at that time only her humble transcriber, and he had had a new plate engraved and set in the frame in his morning room, and the new plate said, Miss Iona Bruce, architect, and no one in Melville Crescent believed the story about the humble transcribing, and no one contradicted him either, because the story was cheap and the plate was true, and the town had decided, by the following season, that the town had always thought Miss Bruce a very talented young woman. In the autumn of the year of her marriage, Iona and Ardrossan came into Edinburgh for the opening of the small hospital at Ullapool, which was to be marked, at the wish of the town of Edinburgh, by a public dinner at the Assembly Rooms in George Street, because Edinburgh had learned by then that a duchess who had built a hospital was a duchess to be dined. And Iona had accepted the dinner because Ardrossan had said at the small volume that she was to accept nothing she did not wish to accept, and she had wished to accept this one, because the dinner was in the same room in which she had, in April 18 months before, heard a word settle on her shoulders like a shawl she had not chosen. She wore, on the evening, a gown of the pale blue of a Highland sky in the last hour before dawn, and she wore her mother's brooch at her throat, and Ardrossan wore black without ornament, and they came in together, at the hour Aunt Fenella had once suggested, and the room, which had been rearranging itself all evening in anticipation of them, stood up as one. And the light in the chandeliers leaned toward them, and the pillars watched, and Iona did not lower her head, and Ardrossan did not step before her, and they walked the length of the room together, and the room understood, before a word was spoken, that a great many small accounts were about to be closed. Aunt Fenella was there, in dove gray, with the ivory shawl put away for the season, and Margaret was there, on the arm of her mild widower from Peebles, and Mr. Kilbride was there, in a coat that was a little too new, and the Miss Cargills were there, and a great many persons who had said 18 months before that a woman of 29 in a gown 3 seasons out of fashion was not much, and Ardrossan led Iona to the head of the room and stood beside her, not before her, and turned to the room, and the room hushed as it had hushed for him at every threshold he had ever crossed. He did not speak at once. He looked once round the room in a single unhurried sweep, and this time the sweep did not pass anyone. It named the room, and it named itself as ready to be named, and he said, at the small volume that did not need to be raised, because the room had already agreed to hear him, my friends. He said, I have not often spoken in a room of this size, because I have not often had anything to say in a room of this size that could not have been said better in a smaller. I have something tonight. He set his hand for a moment on the small brass rail before him. He said, 18 months ago, in this room, A word was said of a woman who was not, at that time, my wife. The word was said behind a fan, and it was said to be heard, and it was heard, and I heard it, though I had not then been introduced to her. I heard it because I was standing 3 paces from the fan, and because the fan did not know I was standing there. He looked round the room. He said, the word was spinster. He let it stand. He said they were wrong. He let that stand also. He said, I have been at some pains in the 18 months since to be certain that I was not, myself, wrong, and I have satisfied myself that I was not, and I shall say to you tonight, in the room in which the word was said, 3 things about the woman who was called it. He said, they were wrong, because she is the finest architect I have known, and she draws with her own hand every plan she signs, and there are, tonight, 4 buildings on the West Coast which stand because she drew them. And there will be more. He said, they were wrong, because she is the finest landlord I have known, and the tenants of Koigach and of Ullapool and of Loch Ewe have, in the year of her marriage, paid rents they can pay, and have kept the roofs their fathers kept, and have sent their children to a school with slates, and will, in the year to come, send them to a school with books. He said, they were wrong, because she is the finest heart I have known, and she forgave, within an hour of leaving a house that had ill-used her, the cousin who had been complicit in the ill use, and she has, in the year of her marriage, forgiven me a great many small stupidities, which I shall not now enumerate to you, and she has done so without ever once presenting me with the account. He paused. He said, at the small volume that carried to the last row, I stand beside her tonight, not before her, and I shall stand beside her, not before her, for as long as I am permitted to stand at all, and I ask this room, which was so quick to name her once, to name her again, and better, and to remember, if we remember nothing else of this evening, that a small candle does more honest work than a large lamp, and that we have among us, in the woman at my side, a candle by which a great many of us, myself first, have been permitted to see. He stopped. He stepped back a half pace, so that the room could see her without seeing him beside her, and the room, which had been silent for the length of his 3 sentences, began, at the back, to applaud, and the applause was not the applause of a room applauding a duke because a duke had spoken. It was the applause of a room that had understood, for once, what it had been complicit in, and had chosen, for once, to be complicit in something better, and it lasted longer than was quite polite, and Iona did not lower her head, and did not lift it either, and let it fall on her the way a hand might have settled on her wrist, brief, deliberate, and, at last, meant. They left before midnight, because Iona had said, at the small volume, that she wished to walk out with him before the wind rose, and Ardrossan had said at the same volume that he wished the same. And they took their leave of Aunt Fenella in the hall, with the small kindness, which was all that either of them now required of the other, and Aunt Fenella took Iona's hand and said, my dear, and did not say the rest, and Iona said, Aunt, and did not say the rest either, and it was, for both women, enough. Margaret was at the door. Margaret kissed the top of Iona's head, once in the affection of a woman who had learned in a year the difference between a proprietor's kiss and a cousin's, and Iona bent her head under it and did not move away, and Margaret said, at the small volume, I am glad, Iona, and Iona said, at the same volume, so am I, Margaret, and they parted without further ceremony. The wind had risen after all, in spite of Iona's wish, and it was coming down George Street from the east with the small persistent pressure of a hand asking to be let in, and it was raining in the fine cold way it rained in Edinburgh at the end of a season. And Ardrosan put his coat over Iona's shoulders, because Iona would not, on principle, permit him to give her a cloak of her own to wear over her hospital dress, and they walked, not to a carriage, because Iona had wished to walk, and they went along George Street and turned into Hanover Street and went down toward Prince's Street. And the storm broke properly at the corner and drove them into a doorway, and they stood in the doorway for a quarter of an hour, while the storm did what a storm did. And Ardrosan did not speak, and Iona did not speak, and Iona thought, small candles, and Ardrosan thought, whatever a man of his composure permitted himself to think in a doorway, with his wife under his coat, in a storm. And by 2 a.m, the storm had gone off toward the Firth, and the wind had died with it, and they walked out into a street washed clean of the season, and everything the season had said, and they went to their own house in Charlotte Square. Because Ardrosan had, in the spring, quietly bought the house at the far corner from Aunt Fenella's, and they went up to bed, and they slept. And the light, when it came in at the east window of the house at 4:30, with the particular clean gold that the light in that country has after a storm. And Iona, who had not slept a full night in Charlotte Square in 10 years, slept until 7, and woke with her hand in her husband's hand, and did not, at once, open her eyes. By the following spring, the small hospital at Ullapool had been extended by 2 beds, and the school at Koigak had been given a second schoolmistress, and a small octagonal pavilion had been built at the end of the walk at Ardrosan House in the country, drawn by the Duchess in a fortnight from the plate on the wall in Melville Crescent. And the plate on the wall in Melville Crescent had been quietly given by Mr. Kilbride to Iona at Aunt Fenella's suggestion, and hung in the pavilion at Ardrosan. And above the plate, the pavilion carried a small stone with a sentence carved into it in her grandmother's hand: "Small candles do more honest work than large lamps." And no one who came to the pavilion needed to be told what the sentence meant. In the June of that year, Lady Bruce, who was 74, sat with Iona on the small bench inside the pavilion and looked at the sentence and did not speak, and Iona, who had grown very like her, sat beside her and did not speak either, and after a long time Lady Bruce said, at the small volume, "My dear." She would have liked this. Iona said, "Grandmother, she has it." Lady Bruce said, "Small candles," and Iona said, "Small candles," and they sat. It was not, Iona thought, later of that summer, and of the summer that followed, and of the years that came after, a perfect thing that had been built between herself and the man she had married. Because the world was not, on the whole, in the business of perfect things, and the two of them were not, on the whole, persons who trusted the perfect. It was not an easy thing, because a great many small accounts had had to be closed, and a great many small habits of self-suppression had had to be, in her, unlearned, and a great many small habits of withholding had had to be, in him, given up, and neither person was young, and neither person was foolish, and they had, both of them, come to the arrangement with a full understanding of the cost of it, and a full willingness to pay. It was, simply, a shared thing. She had spent 10 years in a house in which nothing had been shared with her that had not been calculated first, and she had learned in a year of a house at the far corner of Charlotte Square, and in a house on a coast where the sea came in through the windows on nights the wind chose, and in a small pavilion at Ardrosan under a sentence in her grandmother's hand, that a thing could be shared without first being calculated, and that a life so shared was not perfect, and was not easy, and was, simply, shared, and that was more than enough. She had, on the morning after the dinner at the Assembly Rooms in George Street, opened her eyes at last in the bed in the house, in Charlotte Square, and she had turned her head, and she had looked at the man beside her, and he had turned his head, and he had looked at her, and neither of them had spoken, and he had lifted her hand from where it lay between them, and he had held it in both of his. And he had not let it go, and she had not asked him to, and the light had come in at the east window with the particular clean gold that the light in that country has after a storm, and Iona had been, at last, seen. And was, at last, seeing. And the small candle of her, which had burned steadily and unremarked for 10 years, had at last been permitted to burn steadily and remarked. And it was, on the whole, and by every honest account she was ever afterward asked to render, more than enough, and their two hands, joined and unreleased, turned together in the new light toward the day that was beginning at the window, and the day, for once, kept its promise.